It's really an honor to be here today. I find as someone who's been kind of working at the nexus of leadership, public policy, system change, and social justice for more years than I care to remember now. That it's always great to come into rooms where I can see the next generation of leaders and social innovators who will take up a cause that I am certain my generation will not resolve. And that really is this idea of creating a more just and equitable world, particularly as relates to those who are poor and disadvantaged in any number of ways. Lack of access to opportunity, poor education, victimization or exposure to violence, many of the things that young people suffer. I know that this cause is really important to this institution because of the long and kind of impressive Jesuit history as it relates to kind of knowledge and service and education. And that it's kind of fundamental to its particular approach to changing the world. And it views education as kind of a key strategy for making that actually happen. Not just education in the sense of kind of technical knowledge, which is important in many of the environments in which I work. But as the dean said, this kind of heart and hand aligned with the skill sets required to really make change happen. And rewards that one can derive from doing that particular work and seeing someone else's life improved, someone else's potential enhanced, some community's aspiration achieved, can be more rewarding than anything that we could ever be compensated for doing in our lives. And I've had the privilege, and I do consider it a privilege, to have been engaged in a number of institutions who had that as its mission, who saw that as its purpose, and who afforded me the opportunity to apply my skills, my talents, my passion to those particular causes. I want to start with a question in many respects. And because we talk about social justice, we talk about caring for people. And as someone who spends a fair amount of my time in rooms with elected officials and senior public administrators, I can tell you that when someone in that room says social justice, kind of eyes roll back in people's heads. I mean, really, And the expression that I often see on the faces of those officials, I won't be calling anybody out, is often one that kind of translates into, okay, here comes that utopian request for something that we know can never be achieved. And it's a kind of a polite acceptance of whatever that comment happens to be, and then they're kind of moving on quickly to whatever's up next on that particular agenda. And that somehow this notion of a more just and fair and equitable world is kind of relegated to the sidelines, not taken as a serious kind of intellectual construct, not having the ability or capacity to be implemented in some serious way. It's always polite. There's never any kind of overt pushback. It's just passed over, not responded to. And it's very interesting because there's kind of a group think around this, because the whole room can understand, see, experience that, and collectively kind of move right on with what's going on in that particular space at that time. Now, I'm not one of those particular individuals. I tend not to believe that social justice is some abstract concept. I think that what's going on in the world today suggests to me that it is too important and too connected to this notion of how public institutions go about their business, who they serve, and how they actually serve them. And I think this has been exacerbated most recently in terms of the economic downturn. Now, I'm a former county welfare director, and I can tell you that there's often been this disdain for folks who come into welfare offices. I would often tell my staff in Alameda County that no one comes into a welfare office on a good day. I mean, you show up at 9 o'clock, you take your ticket, you're number 89, and the little clock says they're on number 3, you know, and you just kind of know it's a long day and a lot of intrusive questions that you're going to have to experience through that particular process, often less dignified. And I thought I ran a pretty good shop, 15 kind of centers in Alameda County, right across the bay. I thought I ran a pretty good shop, but it's not the most dignified experience. What we have happening now is vast numbers of folks who have no experience with that particular system now needing help and support. Over 50 million Americans have no health care. 50 million. Over 100 million Americans are poor or near poor. Extraordinary numbers. The social contract that tells us how we relate to one another, what society owes to those who find themselves in some misfortune. Not those who we can casually dismiss as being undeserving, though there are no undeserving poor. Being poor is a hard life. It's a hard life. Try existing in California on $536 a month. Not an easy thing to do. But you have new entrants into that system, some who have worked hard their whole life. And because of changes in the economy, global changes to the economy, through no fault of their own, find themselves in need of some help and support. And the pejoratives associated with this kind of resonate across, many, many areas. You hear folks referred to as the food stamp president because so many folks are suffering food insecurity. It's not a political statement. But I think that from a social justice perspective, in a country that produces more food than its residents could ever consume, in a state like California, it provides 25% of all the food that we grow in this country, that you wouldn't expect a third of our children to be food insecure. It doesn't have to be that way. So this notion of kind of social justice, its relationship to management and administration and leadership, public policy, for me is very real. Not because I'm prone to simply accepting, amorphous intellectual constructs of some type, but because of a very real kind of personal connection to what families are experiencing. Now, some might question, Chet, that's not your plight, but if you worked for me in Alameda County, I was a director who would show up in the waiting room in my jeans and a sweatshirt just to see what was going on, and oftentimes could not be recognized by people who worked for me for years. Another face, another person in need, all right? Another number, another ticket to be serviced. You can learn a lot about your institution and how it cares for people when, even in that false scenario, one endeavors to try to gain some of the experience, learn firsthand about the experiences that people actually have, moving through those particular systems. Nonetheless, the outcomes associated with many of the folks that we say that we serve. And I'm going to use that as an example tonight. I'm going to talk about child welfare, something that I'm well known for. I like to say that I am loved and loathed for it, depending on who you actually talk to. But that's okay, because I think the things that we did for children and around child welfare in Alameda County, which became a national model, and I'm actually 5 years out of that job. I'm still asked to go around and talk to a number of jurisdictions about some of the change that we actually made, and that I'm actually quite proud of, because it is nested for me in this notion of social justice. But let me talk about, or at least I'll offer up to you a rationale for why I think this is really important. And I actually went, as I was preparing for this talk, and I found a piece that I haven't read for quite some time. It was written by Father William Ferree in 1948, and it was titled Introduction to Social Justice. It was re-released in 1997. I actually read it probably shortly thereafter. And in it, Norman Curlin, who actually wrote the foreword, offers up the good father's definition of social justice. And he says, it is work done in association with others to restructure institutions and laws, to advance the perfection of every person and family affected by that institution. I so wish I would have written that. He goes on to state that social justice in turn can be measured for each institution in terms of its success in elevating the dignity, status, power, and well-being of every person it serves. Beautiful. Beautiful. In these straightforward statements, he answers two very important questions. Why social justice? The advancement of the perfection of every person and family you work with and for. And what can it help us achieve? The kind of elevation of the dignity, status, power, and well-being of those in need. Now, someone who works around health, this notion or this concept of well-being is very, very important, because it's an all-encompassing kind of an index of health, right? It's about your self-efficacy, how you feel about yourself, your ability to kind of deal with the traumas and challenges that life will put before all of us who sit in this room. The loss of a parent, the loss of a loved one, a sick child. Part of what helps you get beyond that is your internal sense that you can deal with that, as well as your relationships with people around you. This notion of fidelity relationships. Human beings are social creatures. We don't want to exist on our own. There's a deficit in the experience of life when that is in fact the case. And so we should think about how our systems kind of organize themselves to provide a level of dignity and respect and empowerment and comfort for those that they actually serve. Particularly institutions that are in the business of pursuing the public good. In many respects, it is the basis for their creation. And so whether you're a fireman or a policeman or a human service agency director or a health director, you're working on behalf of others. Now, I'm a storyteller, and I want to share with you a story. And it's a child welfare story. I then want to offer some comments on how I work to create change. And I'm going to borrow your mantra, how to change the world from here. And I know that it's a metaphor because here is different for all of us. Right? So as I tell this story, my here is working first as the Director of Children and Family Services in Alameda County, and then subsequently as its agency director. It is an integrated public institution as well. There are two caveats I want to offer up early, and that is I don't want you to suffer too much the details of the story. I chose it because I think it's a compelling one, but the lessons that I pull out of that particular experience I have found to be applicable to other areas of work that I've actually engaged in. But as I said, I am a storyteller, so it just makes it easier for me to kind of share my experience with you. And second, I just want you to kind of assume, as I have from the start, that you're not working by yourself. Because, social change is not a solo activity. Right? This is not like, figure skating individually, because you could be in a team. It's, more like collective action. At its very roots, it's about, as Marie says, working in concert with others to perfect, the life and livelihoods of those that we actually serve. And I believe that, when you give these kind of talks, you should leave people with something they can actually take away. They say it's easiest for us to hold 3 things in our head at a time. I'm going to leave you with 6. This is a university, you're smart people. You could double that. You can double that. And I call them my 6 maxims, just general rules, expectations for leaders interested in facilitating change from wherever your hair happens to be. Maxim number 1. Change will always be an imperfect art because challenges to it often arrive unannounced and from the most unexpected of places. About 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago, I was working for a large foundation in New York City. I had previously been a foster parent, and I had about 5 young men who are now grown men that I had the privilege of raising for part of their lives. They each were able to go back to their families over time. For some it worked, for some it actually did not. I'd been a fellow at another large foundation back east, and during my fellowship year, I had actually worked in Alameda County, and thus the relationship between my subsequent time there. And while I was traveling back and forth between New York and San Francisco, I used to run the foundation's offices here in the city. I received a call from one of the young men that had lived with me for about 7 years. I'll call him Andre. Andre actually called me via the social service agency here because he had turned 18. And he was about to be released from care. And if you know anything about child welfare, at 18, if you're not going to graduate from school in a year, you're asked to leave your group home or foster home. And so he was about to be literally put out in the street. And he was calling me because he was trying to find whomever he could find to help him. He said, "Pop," which is what he always called me, "probably going to end up homeless if, things don't change." I hung up the phone from Theodore after telling him, "I'm on my way back. I'll get back late tonight. Meet me at social services tomorrow morning at about 10 o'clock. And it may be 5 minutes or 3 minutes or 7 minutes. I really don't know. So I was waiting in the airport. My phone rang again, and it was a gentleman who I had worked for during my fellowship in Alameda County. And he says to me, "Chet, my child welfare director is retiring. Would you take that job?" So I said to myself, I've got this phone call 3, 5, 7 minutes ago. And I get a subsequent phone call about an opportunity. And, sometimes you find a job. Sometimes the job finds you. Some things are kind of prophetic in the way that they actually happen. And I said to him then, and we had talked previously, I said, "Roger, I think I'll take that job. Maybe we can make some changes." He said, "Chet, change would be great." So I took the job. I showed up on my birthday, the first day, November 30th was my first day as the child welfare director in Alameda County. I was told there were some challenges to the system, as there are some challenges to all child welfare systems in the country. We had a corrective action plan, and I was supposed to take it to Sacramento, to the state, and deliver the corrective action plan and introduce myself to all the state leaders about, I was the new director of child welfare. I drive up, I walk into the room, and I hand them the envelope with the plan in it, and I'm fairly excited, and they said, could you come with us, Mr. Hewitt? I said, of course. They said, we'll take you into counsel's office. Counsel's office? You know, we have a counselor sitting here. Often not a good thing. All right? Particularly for the new guy. Larry Bolton, never forget his name. General Counsel, Health and Human Services, State of California. I walk into Mr. Bolton's office and he hands me an envelope. I said, is it a subpoena? He says, no, but it's something that you're really going to want to read. It was what's known as a 10605 notice. It was a threat of state takeover from the state. The system had been performing so poorly for so long. The state has decided the county should not be running its own child welfare system anymore. So it was a very interesting 2 weeks on the job. And I remember my supervisor back at Rockefeller, who warned me about taking the job, calling me up after it was kind of front page news on a Chronicle and saying, Chet, do you want your own job back? I said, Julio, no, I think I'll stick this one out. 15 years of failed audits, threatened state takeover, a system that operated with a lack of accountability, despite it being the parent, legally, of 5,000 children in the county. And we knew we had to do something different. We had to make some change. A week and a half after that, the person who recruited me decides they're actually leaving. Took a job in San Diego, where the sun shines more often and it's a little bit warmer. I thought he was trying to get out of the heat myself, but maybe he was just trying to change jurisdictions. So as I said, if you're in this business, expect things to arrive, from unexpected places. It's an art form change. It's not a linear process. And sometimes challenges can really be opportunities to make things happen that perhaps otherwise, would not have happened. And we did great. The quickest turnaround in the history of the state of California for a so threatened child welfare agency. Put together a new type of corrective action plan. I actually told the state theirs actually didn't work so well. We put in timelines and outcome measures, built an evaluation team to determine whether we were making progress, had focus group with parents about their expectations of the system, decided we would be a more inclusive and engaged system. We talked to behavioral health, that we talked to the income support side of the program to get families what they actually needed. And in 18 months, the state retreated, and we had full control over the system. We were, as they described, compliant with the regulatory framework that was developed by the state. And then we began to look at what we were doing. And we were not satisfied. And I can tell you that's where lesson number 2 comes in. Because if you're serious about social justice, if you're serious about systemic change, if you're serious about helping the poor and disadvantaged, then you'll realize that change will likely require for you to do much more work than being compliant. Compliant is important and insufficient at the same time. While our I's were dotted, while our T's were crossed, but we still had some serious problems. There was an ongoing kind of misalignment between family needs and the services and supports we actually offered. Now, we got our court reports in on time, but perhaps we didn't visit Johnny on time or afford his mother a good opportunity to perhaps receive the benefits of good social work. That's not part of the regulatory framework. My staff would say, you don't have to worry about that. No one's measuring that. We had a strong focus on process, not on outcomes. And we had a severely limited capacity to discuss one of the things that was most troubling about the way the system operated. In a county where 15% of its 0 to 17 population, that's who child welfare serves, was African American, over 70% of the kids were African American. 70% of the kids. But nobody's measuring that. That's not a regulatory violation. That's okay. No, it's really not. Something's wrong. And we should be comfortable enough as professionals to ask ourselves the serious questions about what is driving that. We actually did a study of over 1,000 blue sheets. This is for every call that comes in and gets a blue sheet. And we found that 75% of our kids came from 3 communities: East Oakland, West Oakland, and South Haywood. We looked at the reasons they were brought into care, and we compared them to communities that were not of color from the eastern part of our county, that had similar allegations. We found that less than 4 to 5% of those kids came into care. We knew that this connection between poverty, right, and abuse was being misinterpreted by staff. They would go into a household that perhaps didn't look as nice, or a community that wasn't as fancy, and would seem or believe that it was somehow more appropriate to bring those children into care. Now, if you know about the long-term outcomes for kids who grow up in foster care, it's really not a good thing. Over 50% of them, if they age out of care, will be homeless within 2 years. Half the young women will be parents. Between 50 and 70% will never finish high school. And about 40% of the young men will be in jail. A study done in California found that some 60 to 70% of all inmates serving life terms are actually former foster youth. So, it's not a system that you want children to grow up in. And despite not being a regulatory violation, as I said, you knew we had to do something about that. So you know that this notion of simply being compliant is just, not aligned with this notion of social justice. Now, if you know about child welfare, people will say, well, Chet, that's changed. We have new laws. We're focused more on outcomes, and that is true. And it is late in coming, and a great thing to have happen at the same time. But I would still say that many of the problems that the system has had for a generation are still very present. Number 3, which is also very important, and it says that simply the change requires more than a vision and a pithy mission statement. It requires a clear and consistently applied set of core values. And this is really, really important because the social service agency, we had a nice vision statement. We had a clear, kind of pithy mission statement. We didn't have a value statement. And values are important. Core values are essential. Because you have got to be able to understand and test whether the things you actually do are aligned with the values that you say you actually have. Mission statements are often kind of vague and don't speak to process. They speak to usually this aspirational statement of something that you want to achieve. That's wonderful. But insufficient in the kind of mechanics, the management side of making change happen. You've got to be very clear. We decided that our kind of orientation would say children and families first, and that our values would be applied by testing what we were proposing against this notion of does it put children and families first? And we made it short and sweet because we said to folks, you could test it before you bring it to us. Right? And if it fails your test, you can kind of keep the idea to yourself. Because we're going to be very clear about the type of institution that we really want to be. We're going to be clear about how we're going to go about this work. We also said that for us, child welfare or social service was going to be developmental, which is at the heart of, social justice, this notion of development, human development. In the world of social work, there's always a challenge between whether the system is residual or developmental. Residual systems are systems that actually seek to help people. When you have fallen to a point that the system has a legal responsibility and legal authority, referred to as probable cause, to intercede in your personal life. Right? So we didn't help families until they had gotten to a point where we could go in and legally remove the child from the parent. That was the standard. Our value, or our new value, said, no, we're going to be a developmental system. And that meant if we seen somebody suffering and struggling and that we became aware of that, we were going to help them before they got to that particular point. We said that communities and families were going to be essential partners in our work. We made the statement and made it, kind of admitted that there was no substitute for families. There is no substitute for the kind of personal relationships and connections that we need to develop as healthy human beings. Love, empathy, compassion. Those things are learned. Now, I started my career in juvenile justice, and I'll tell you, some of the scariest folks I ever met are folks who don't have that. It's not something you take from a child without really being concerned about what the long-term implications of that could actually be. We knew that no matter how good we were at our work, that we were no replacement for that relationship. And I say family in the broadest of terms. Fictive relations. We all have aunts who aren't quite related to us by blood, but who are our aunts. All right? Folks who will show up and take care of you. That's how communities organize themselves. I see heads now, you know exactly what I mean. Now, those are the people that you have got to bring into a system. It can't be closed and leave people out. We said that leadership and commitment was going to be essential to our success, and we were going to value that. We were going to value the expression of that within the system. And not just simply by executive staff, but we wanted peers to hold their co-workers to that particular standard. Good idea is a good idea. It doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's the janitor in the back of the room and that's the best idea, what a good manager can do is surface that idea, right? Work it through. Make it happen. And so, we had this kind of value-driven, core value framework that served us, quite well. And from that, we were able to move on and actually begin to put a set of actionable and testable strategies into place to ensure that there was a good alignment between our practice and our alignment. And we did some very interesting things, often with external funds, and I'll talk about the importance and limitations on that, going forward. And then, the science behind it, but actually evaluate whether these things had any effect or the hoped for effect. But you'll see as I describe them how they represent our values. We put in place a thing called structured decision making, the first county in the state of California. And it is a validated assessment tool for the scientists in the room, right? That actually allows you to determine whether or not you should bring a child into care. Now, I had folks tell me, since I'm not a social worker by training, that I was taking away the discretion of the social worker. And I showed them the 1,000 blue sheets. I said, that's the discretion of the social worker right there. 75% of the kids coming from 3 communities. So if you're telling me that's what I'm taking away, you're exactly correct. What I want is a more objective assessment about whether that child is at risk, not if that child is poor. Because some of us who've grown up in poor households know that doesn't mean that you're not loved or cared for. right? It may not look as nice as some other places people may be exposed to. But let's not, get too far out of bounds about what that actually means when you're thinking about interceding at that level in the life of a child. That tool actually helped reduce intakes into the system over its first 2 years by 50%. And people could not justify. And it actually has an override in. You can actually override the system. But you got to say why you did that. And it was very interesting to us that people couldn't come up with justifications for doing things that we knew from the data they probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place. We built an alternative response team. I talked about this, and that was a system that was really to help families before we had to remove the children. We also put in place a thing called team decision making, which when we put kids into court and we talked about what was going to happen to a kid who had to come into care, that you could bring anybody into that room that a family wanted. You could bring your pastor, you could bring your neighbor, you bring your sister, your brother, niece and nephew. Because one of the things that we found is that rather than putting kids into foster home and group homes, a traumatic experience for a 6-year-old who gets pulled from a home at night, taken to sit in a police station for 4 hours, and then shows up at a home of a family he's never seen before, or she's never seen before. All right. But these individuals were resources. You kind of empower that family to have some choice, to have some input in how you interceded. We built an assessment center, and we kind of raised a lot of money to do this quickly. There was some benefit to having come from the world of philanthropy. Because when I went out one evening and I witnessed the removal of a child, and I said, well, where are they going to go? And they said, well, we're going to sit in the police station. I was appalled. I was shocked. And then I was appalled. I couldn't believe that's how we organized our system. And so we built a system, a beautiful center for kids. It was child-friendly with video games and sleeping stations and other things. And by holding kids there, you could actually go out and find family members who perhaps could provide, a place for that child to go. So rather than going to a group home, you can actually go to your auntie's house, or to grandma, or to somebody else who you knew, who you would feel safer with. We expanded mental health services. We built kinship support centers. We were shocked at the number of seniors who were raising their children, their children's children. Grandmothers who had kind of stepped up and stepped in and who were doing this all on their own. These are not folks who are looking for simply a handout. These are folks who are looking for some help. And we should endeavor, using our particular framework, to figure out a way to do that, to offer to them with dignity and a level of respect. And I'll tell you that one of the most important or deplorable things about this, because we argued a lot about whether we should be helping with resources these families, who some argued had the responsibility to do this, without our intervention. I can tell you, whenever I sent a child to a group home, one of the worst places you can grow up as a child, we wrote a check for almost $9,000 per month per child. Grandma would take them for $500 and some support. Now, we were called to provide assistance to folks who had found it within themselves to take on a responsibility that we were prepared to pay extraordinary sums of money for, as long as it wasn't a family member, as long as it wasn't a relative. We also built the largest housing program for emancipated youth in the state of California, working with a good friend, Amy Lemley, who founded the First Place Fund, a well-known group that actually houses emancipated youth, who raised some money and gave it to the county that we used to leverage some state and federal resources and gave it all back to them. Because we understood that when you're 18, you're not ready to live on your own. Most of us, those of us who are fortunate to go to college, remember, being in dorms with TAs, because half of us lost our mind when we first got on that campus, right? You can laugh, because it's probably true. But we also know that we had people who cared enough about us that when we found ourselves in some difficulty, they were able to help and support us. Because it's not unusual for someone at that place in life to not always be making the best decisions. It might have seemed like the most fun at the time, but sometimes they're not the best decisions for folks to actually make. We didn't believe, given our framework, that somehow our responsibility ended because you had reached your majority. That somehow we should expect you to be prepared to deal with all the challenges life would present. And that we would see ourselves as having fulfilled our mission and responsibility because we got you to your 18th birthday. Forget the fact that half our kids didn't graduate from high school, or that a third of them had no family members to go to. The compliance criteria was you turned 18. The social justice criteria, the fair, just world criteria was yes, and we're still responsible for your development. So number 5 for me, change requires a focus on sustainability and scalability from the start, as they are often the biggest threats to its preservation. And by that I mean that when you do change, we built all these wonderful programs. We did it by raising money, short-term money from foundations, money from special programs. We tested them, we evaluated them, they were all successful. And if you work in a world of kind of social policy, you see lots of pilots come and go. Because if they're not built into the kind of policy structure, they don't have a sustainable funding stream to them, then when that temporary money that you actually raise goes away, so does your most effective programs. They're like appendages of sorts. They get cut off when the dollars go away. And I've seen this happen many, many times, particularly having worked in philanthropy. And we were committed early on not to have that happen. And so, we started thinking about, well, how could we get around this? What could we actually do? How could we move kind of the knowledge we had gained into the kind of policy environment to actually build a much more sustainable model, one that really represented a deeper level of change, one that would be systemic, that would last beyond my leadership or my time, my tour of duty, and actually represent a real commitment, not only to social justice, because that's a kind of a intellectual concept, but a real commitment to the children that we actually serve, a real commitment to the families that we serve. And so we took what I consider to be our biggest risk. And this is one, and I said this earlier, that about my work in child welfare, about being loved and loathed, depending on who you speak to. And there has been a cost to this, and we won't go into that, but it's really, really true. And I just want to say that these kind of 6 maxims kind of work, this is not a linear thing, they kind of work interactively, because I said earlier that sometimes the challenge to change comes from unanticipated places, and I can tell you a lot of my best friends challenge me deeply about what I will tell you about next. I have a very good friend and mentor who's very well known and will remain nameless in Washington, D.C., who called me up and asked me if I had lost my mind. Actually, she said my good sense, to be more accurate. Because what we did next was, in the world of progressive politics, in many respects sacrilegious, in that we decided that we would rethink the entitlement. Child welfare is an entitlement program. The federal government will pay half of the cost of removing any child, any number of children from their homes. 5,000, 10,000, they don't care. It's not about numbers. The thing that's a problem with that is that they only support and fund programs after you remove the child from the home. So we had built this huge infrastructure about prevention, kind of a public health model. Prevention, early intervention. Our caseload that was at 5,000 was now at 2,400. Kids were staying home in families, safe. Families that didn't have health care, and that was the reason for the call. We enrolled them in subsidized health care. Families didn't have food, we enrolled them in food stamps. Families didn't have income, we enrolled them in the welfare program. We found families willing to struggle with all their challenges to keep their families intact. And we've seen as our charge the offer of help and support in the most dignified way that we possibly could. And what was the result of that? We lost half of the money. They say the world operates on incentives. That's a big disincentive to doing good. Right? And so we agreed we would take the biggest gamble that we had taken yet. And through the state of California, linked to the federal government, we applied for what's known nationally as the 4E waiver. And we cut a pretty good deal with the feds. We said for limited growth, 2% a year. We will be responsible for any growth in our caseload beyond that, 100% on our dime. A risk, should we have to bring any number of new kids into care. And in return, what we wanted from you was complete flexibility with whatever money that we had now, and we would grow over time. And the Fed said, that sounds like a pretty good deal. We'll take that. We took our pilots, which we had been using in different communities, primarily targeting the communities that most of our kids came from, and we ramped them up so they would be available to everyone. Social justice, that's equity. Good program, it's effective, everybody should have access to it, right? And we found that our caseload continues to decline. The caseload in Alameda County today is about 1,400, and still declining. We made every one of those pilots permanent features of the child welfare system. The savings after 4.5 years is $100 million. So you can not only do well or do what's right, you can actually do good in the kind of fiscal sense of that particular word. Now, in that agreement, we were wise enough to ensure that all the money had to be reinvested in child welfare. So I've been around county politics long enough to know that you save that kind of money and someone will want to spend it on something else. Right? But we took the risk. We said we're going to spend it on children. That's exactly what is happening. And all the folks who said that we were tampering with the entitlement, and in fact we were. No, we said back to them that no system is entitled to do harm to children. And if that's what the entitlement was causing us to do, I know this is a Jesuit school, but be damned with the entitlement. And that's my sixth lesson. That's the change requires that neither the fear of failure or the voice of opposition should ever result in your loss of courage or your willingness to do what you know to be right. And that's a big one, because many of the people that I admired for a long time, had some very unpleasant things to say about me. Thought we were foolish, too big a risk. Last few days I've been on the phone with a large foundation, the nation's largest that does child and welfare work, and 30 states want to do it. They're all considering how they too can figure out how to do better by their children, better by the folks who finance that particular system. And in the process, because I think this is one of the things that I think social justice really affords you. As you think about working the nexus between public policy, social justice, and systems change, and this notion of good management, is a very good feeling about yourself. Because while it was perhaps one of the hardest things I did professionally, and at times really questioned whether it was the right thing to do, it may well, in fact, be the thing that I will be most known for the rest of my life. Half of my role as president of a foundation isn't just to figure out how to give away money, and folks think that's very easy. And I say, you think that's easy until you plan to do it well, because you can just give away money. It's actually to earn money, because the foundation model is really around having a corpus, investing it, and giving away some of the benefits of that. Legally, 5% a year is what you have to give away. And in doing that, we always talk about the risk-reward premium, right? And that is, you will take a higher risk if the reward, the possibility for return, is greater. You get paid for your risk. And while this isn't, or doesn't apply completely when we talk about the lives of people, we did, in many respects, believe that the risk of having to pay for new entrants into the system ourselves was worse the possible rewards we would get if we can build a system that was really able to help children. I mean, designed to help children, designed to support families. That was a worthy experiment. And one that has proven to be very successful. My successors at Alameda County have done a tremendous job beyond that which I was able to do in terms of our initial plan for implementation. I said when I started my remarks that it's always great to be in a room with young folks who aspire to do great things. And Lori Jones, who was the director in Alameda County, was a protege of mine. She was my 4E waiver director, and she's now the director of the agency. Sometimes a little bit of courage, the willingness to take a little bit of risk, thoughtful risk. Not just risk, thoughtful risk. To use the parlance of the world of investment, can pay big dividends. We cashed that coupon in and we did quite well. So, is any of this transferable? Does it mean anything else? Let me quickly just kind of move through my next assignment, because I left the county in 2007, went to Sacramento, managed a healthcare foundation, now moved into the world of health, and I found that everything that I've learned and experienced and the lessons that I've shared with you, were as important in my next job as they were in my last. And I'll do this quickly. The first one was change is an imperfect art because obstacles are impolite and often arrive unannounced. So I started my job in 2007, new job, foundation, we give away money. I'm coming out of the world of the public sector. I love public sector work. It is hard, but it can be very, very rewarding. And so I think I'm in for another experience, right? And then comes 2008, the Great Recession, right? Some foundations went out of business, right? Because where's our money? In the stock market. Never forget March 2009. Stock market, when I started, was 14,000. March, 6,600. Did anybody have a dime? Unexpected. New challenge. What do we do? Two, change, particularly if you want to address it through a social justice orientation, requires more than compliance. But we could have been compliant. I told you what compliant was earlier. 5% giveaway, right? We lost half our corpus. But in the tax code, there's a thing called carryover. small technicality. If you've given away more in previous years than your current value, you can get credit for that particular money. We were in a position to go for 3 or 4 years and we didn't have to give away a dime. We would have been very compliant. Insufficient. For a $100 million institution in a community struggling with the great downturn, that we would sit on our riches. It was interesting. We thought about what was happening in many communities and the reports we would hear because of the parts we dealt with so many individuals. And they would often come in somewhat kind of anecdotal ways. I met with a group of food bank directors. They said, one of the things that we know that's really different about this recession, Chet, or this downturn is that we have some very nice cars driving up to the food bank. Like you wouldn't believe it. We're used to seeing people come in sometimes on bikes. It's, we got folks in cars that like, I can't afford driving up. People had lost their jobs. Didn't know where to turn. All of a sudden, those systems of support seem a little bit more friendly, seem a little bit more necessary. Compliance wouldn't have cut it. So that change requires more than a vision and mission. It requires a clear and consistently applied set of values. We didn't have a mission statement or a value statement. One of the things that I did when I first arrived was to actually create one, and it actually proved to be pretty valuable. Because now in this period of challenge, we have to kind of go back to that, right? We said that we seek opportunities to support innovation and ideas and solutions. We uphold high ethical standards. We accept our responsibility as stewards of the foundation's resources. We hold ourselves accountable for what we set out to accomplish. And as the Sierra Health Foundation, our mission was to provide for a healthful life for all Northern Californians. Would carryover allow us to do that? We just stopped giving? The folks who told us the food banks were bare, we would not support them? IRS couldn't say anything. We didn't have to do anything. We decided that we would live by our values. We maintained our grant making, developed a ramp down strategy. We knew we had to spend a little less. Turned around $1 million campaign to actually restock food banks and safety net programs across the 26 counties in Northern California. We decided we would help people. That's who we were. That's what we're designed to do. And our values, not the regulatory environment, would determine how we would behave. So that change requires actionable and testable strategies. But we did that through our safety net program. So that requires you to focus on sustainability and scalability. We knew we were a foundation half the size we were 2 years earlier. We decided that we would change our model of philanthropy. We're a private foundation. We don't usually accept money. We have our own money. We give it away. There's a real kind of empowerment experience from that, right? Because you don't have to listen to anybody else's ideas. You kind of fund what you think is important. Well, in a community that we knew we couldn't resolve all those issues, we needed outside partners, other foundations. And when you make deals like that with people, when you work in collaboration, as I said earlier about child welfare, it can't be your own idea. Other people have ideas as well. You have to sit in a room, you have to negotiate things. To try to figure out, you have to give up some of that power. You have to share it with other people. In the way we shared power with those families in child welfare. You gotta allow their ideas to take some root. And in that, you can find better ways to do business. We changed our program direction to look at the social determinants of health. That's what we fund, not just clinical care. We looked at health disparities and health equity. Fairness being what we're after within that health space. Same 3 communities that most of the kids from child welfare come from, they have some of the highest health disparities in the Bay Area. Rich talked about my colleague who was a health director in a study that he actually did in East Oakland. We're within a 2-mile distance. The average lifespan is 15 years different. That's 20% of a human's life. We can actually tell in this country how long you will live by your zip code. And the most powerful intervention for that? Does anyone know what the most powerful intervention for reducing that disparity is? Education. It's not access to health care. The more educated you are, the longer you will live. The healthier you will be. Determines the food you eat, the community in which you live, your sense of self-efficacy. My last was that, your fear of failure should never cause you to lose your courage to take on that big, risky idea. 7 months ago, I convinced my board to found a new 501c3 called the Center for Health Program Management. I have the pleasure of serving as the president and CEO of that as well. We've developed a new set of public-private partnerships. We've given up some of our power. We shared it with communities who inform us about what they need, like the food bank example. And the impact has been similar. I talked about what has happened in child welfare. Our corpus is half of what it was 4 years ago. But our giving has increased 300%. So as you think about change, and you think about new models, and you think about what it means to really engage in collective action, I hope that some of what I shared kind of inspires some of you to not only know or believe that you are quite capable of doing extraordinary things if you're willing to really think about change. I'll also say that what you have to bring that I didn't talk a lot about today is a level of commitment and passion for this work. Because I fundamentally believe that this is not about a job or employment. This has got to be your vocation. There are days when it's quite difficult. I didn't talk about some of those nights when you think about when some bad things happen to children. My wife knows that there's many nights when I sat up worrying about what was going to be in the paper the next day, or how things were going to be perceived, or who was going to call me or call me out, or say some things that were probably not appropriate. I also would say that don't underestimate where your opposition will come from, because when we did the change in Alameda County, and I'll just share this is the last thing I'll say because I do want to take some questions, but and we were going to the Board of Supervisors to approve the 4-year waiver. The folks who opposed me the most were the folks who actually took care of children. It's a census system. They get paid for the number of beds they fill. I was depopulating the system. Providers, all of whom were good friends of mine, progressive folks, organized a advocacy group and said that what we were doing was bad and wrong. Our response to that was to organize a faith group that actually talked about the moral responsibility we had, not the financial one. And I'll never forget the day that we were going for final board approval. I often, as a good friend of mine, Reverend Langford, we always talk about this story. My wife has heard it more times than she probably cares to. I never forget the day that we were getting final approval. We were at the board and it was all set to go. And the opposition group was outside of the hall, the Board of Supervisors chambers, prepared to come in and say whatever they were going to say. And on the left side of that hall, we had 10 pastors from various religious institutions who were prepared to talk about the moral responsibility we had to children. I remember a woman who's become a friend again. She was a friend before, actually, who was going to be the lead spokesperson, kind of peering into the room as I was sitting behind the bar where all the appointed officials sat. And when she seen them, she just walked back out. I remember when the item came up on the agenda and the board approved it and then opened it up for comment. She walked down the center aisle and said, we support Director Hewitt's recommendation. And I share that because sometimes when you work from this kind of place of kind of faith and you think about those values, and they mean more to you than just words on paper, it can be a powerful force for change. And sometimes when the forces line up against it, they too realize that there are certain things that opposition alone can't stop. Because what they had was opposition, not an alternative idea, right? Keep things as they actually were. And that was for no benefit for kids. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope my story has been meaningful to those of you in this audience this evening. And I want to thank President Previtt, the Dean, my good friend Rich, for affording me the opportunity to speak with you this evening. Thank you.